So I'd like to welcome you to the second cafe, sitting at the cafe. George Foden from BRE and I will be talking a little bit about the climate and environmental concerns and humanitarian action. And we're going to focus in on the SMAC. Try to remember what that really means, but just keep it in mind, SMAC. And we'll do a little presentation about some background and the tool, and then we'll open up for questions and discussions. Next slide, please. So today, what we're serving at the cafe is, first of all, an overview of why the environment is important. Many of you already may know this, but we just want to make sure that that's something that we've had a chance to talk about. We'll talk about some of the key stuff, some of the documents and some of the tools that are available. And we recognize that there's actually other presentations, other cafes that are talking about the NEAT Plus and other kinds of things like that. There is quite a lot of stuff out there. Then George will talk about the shelter lifecycle analysis tool and show you how it can be used. It's in beta version right now, or will be in beta very shortly. So we are looking for people to use it. But you can just get a good idea about what it tells you, what it can be used for. And then we'll have a chance for questions, and we can talk about some of the broader issues if you want. Next slide, please. So you're all probably aware of this, but what we want to think about is why the environment? Why is the environment important to humanitarian assistance? Well, starting with the basic human rights. People have a right to a clean and safe environment, to place to live, good shelter, water supply, health care, all these other kinds of things that all revolve around the environment. And when we talk about environment here, we're talking about the human-centered environment. That's to say, the natural environment surrounding the human. The human is part of the environment. Sometimes there's a little confusion with the word environment and ecosystem. But in this case, it's the human-centered in the environment, the natural and built environment. We have the principle of do no harm. So providing assistance to people that then results in harm to them because too many trees are cut down, because there are landslides, because their houses are put in a flood zone, doesn't make sense. It goes against the do no harm principle. We have within the sphere standards, particularly under the shelter standards, number 7, I believe it is, that specifically talks about environmental impact of shelter. But throughout the sphere standards, there are other elements that look at the environment as an important part of providing the minimum standard of adequate humanitarian assistance. There's also the good practice. So if you go into a situation and you do something that harms people, that's not good practice. If you do something that improves the conditions, for instance, disaster risk reduction, which often involves the environment, that is good practice. So when we talk about good practice, we're also talking about the environment. And then the final point is that oftentimes in responding to a disaster, we get tunnel vision. We focus on providing plastic sheeting or providing water or providing healthcare, and we don't look at the broader issues, for instance, with plastic sheeting, what's going to happen to the plastic sheeting when it's no longer usable in 6 months. We're providing healthcare, what's happening to the healthcare waste. We're providing water, what's happening to the aquifer, what contamination might be in the water, for instance, arsenic. So looking at some of these other issues, these are all part of the environment, and sort of expanding your view is the whole thing that the environment is about. Next slide, please. So here's some of the key stuff, and I will share the presentation with you shortly in the chat box. But we have EHA Connect. And you have the website there. We have the EE Center. We have the EHA Connect as well. And we also have the EHA. And so there's a lot of E stuff. These are 3 websites that are very useful to you in finding out a lot of information about the environment and humanitarian assistance. There's also the DEC in the UK. And they have a group that deals with environment. There's group URD, which has been coordinating particularly a Francophone group on looking at environmental issues and humanitarian assistance. They themselves also have a lot of useful information on their website and through their monthly newsletter. There's a USAID-led project that's looking at packaging, which has become a major issue now, particularly not using too much packaging and having something to do with the packaging once it's finished. There's nature-based adaptation, And there's also eco-DRR, environment, ecosystem DRR, disaster risk reduction. And these two things overlap. NBA tends to be more climate focused and ecosystem DRR tends to be more disaster risk reduction, but they're both the same ends of the situation here. So we need to look at those things. There's the NEAT Plus, which they're talking about in another session. And also, for instance, there's a new version of the Rapid Environmental Impact Assessment tool, which can be used to look at broader environmental issues. Also, we've seen an increased interest among donors as well as the general population on the carbon footprint. And that's really what the tool that George is going to talk about next is about. It's about looking at the carbon footprint, or in standard terms, the CO2 equivalent footprint of sheltering operations. George.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Yeah, so just to kind of sort of lead on from that, really, as Kelly mentioned, there's a huge amount of tools and options out there for looking at environmental assessment and thinking about the environment in shelter response. And what we wanted to do was kind of think about life cycle assessment in kind of the full life cycle of a shelter, all the way from cradle to grave, or even sort of cradle to cradle, kind of looking at beyond just what happens from kind of sourcing materials and giving them to a population. What's kind of the overall environmental impact of what we do in the shelter sector. And in terms of looking at this, obviously, as Kenny mentioned, there's tools like the NEAT Plus tool and others that look at environmental assessments from a kind of local level, and particularly how what we're doing might be impacting a local community and affecting their livelihood opportunities or their sort of future community resilience and things like that. But considering impact on a global level, looking more at kind of the contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, in particularly carbon emissions, is less well established in the humanitarian sector and less well considered. And so we wanted to look at developing a simplified life cycle assessment tool that can quickly provide a result expressed as CO2 equivalent emissions, looking at this carbon footprint of shelter operations, with the idea being that having an idea of the carbon footprint of a specific shelter type, a specific shelter methodology or typology, would allow designers and constructors and those involved in procurement to modify designs, to modify material selection in order to minimize CO2 equivalence. And to help hopefully improve the output of the final shelter product by informing decision making. This isn't designed to be a tool that's going to make your decision about which shelter to build, but it helps inform that decision, and it will give kind of a brief overview in terms of CO2 equivalence. It will give you an idea of the carbon footprint that a certain shelter typology might be leaving behind, so you can use that to inform your decision making. And as Kelly kind of mentioned, that there's various reasons for wanting to do this. One of them is the latest addition to the shelter standards in Sphere, and in particular the indicator 3 in shelter standard 7, which is percentage of shelter constructions using low carbon emission construction materials and methods. And whilst the tool that that's in development at the moment kind of doesn't necessarily define low carbon emission construction materials, what it does do is allow for a comparison between the different types of materials that you might be using. So you can enter in, if you're using a kind of standard plastic tarpaulin temporary shelter versus using some other kind of bamboo structure, you can compare those in terms of the expected carbon footprint, and therefore identify and report on what's being done to hopefully reduce the environmental impact of shelter options. So just to touch on the tool itself, this has been developed by BRE. It's been based on a tool that we'd previously developed called List, which was originally intended for shop fit out. So the idea was that it's a tool that's simple to use. It requires only sort of basic input. If you have the quantity of materials that you're using, you have an understanding of the packaging that those materials come in, and an idea of the distance and method by which that material is being transported to its use point, then that's pretty much all you need to fill out the Excel spreadsheet, and the tool will do the calculation for you and provide feedback on carbon footprint in the criteria on the slide there, looking at raw materials, packaging, transport, and end of life. And it will give you a simple CO2 equivalent impact figure that can be used to support and inform decision making. And so, as you can kind of see on the picture there, this is kind of, it's again not something that will make your decision for you, but at each point of kind of shelter development, shelter construction, procurement, you can consider CO2 equivalent as one of the things that influences environmental impact. And it gives you more data, more information to play around with and think about when you're involved in making decisions about shelter. And so this is an example of the sort of outputs that you will get from the tool. So again, with the basic input of information that you have available into the spreadsheet, you'll get these kind of outputs to help with deciding which shelter typology to go for. So on the left there, you can see this is a comparison of 3 different shelter types or shelter specifications. Shelters 1 and 3 have obviously both scored a lot better than shelter 2. They're both sort of just over 20 kilograms of CO2 equivalents emissions per unit, so per shelter. But shelter 2 has a much higher impact, and so performs a lot worse in terms of its environmental impact. And the immediate question there is probably, why is that? What's the difference? And that's what the graph on the right shows you. So you can see quite quickly, looking at the graph on the right, that the overwhelming percentage breakdown for CO2 impact is coming from transport. And so transport is really the problem there. What you'd see if you looked into the data was, for the sake of this example, we had 3 different shelters, all of which were sourced in the US and then transported to a point of use. So they traveled the same distance, but specification 1 and 3 were both shipped ahead of time. And so this would be a situation where you're kind of involved in kind of preparation and prevention sort of programming and shipping something and storing it nearer to the point of use. Whereas specification 2 has been sort of deployed in an emergency response, and therefore it's been flown. And obviously air freight is a much higher impact in terms of CO2, and that is what accounts, as you can see in the breakdown, for the overwhelming impact on shelter 2. So it'd be as simple as, if we can find a way to get shelter 2 to its location that's better than flight, then we can actually probably reduce that quite a lot. And that's the sort of decision making that this tool can hopefully help you to make. You can see with specification 3 there as well, about 30% of its CO2 impact comes from packaging, which is quite a large percentage. That's probably due to using plastic packaging, other types of packaging that are unsustainable or environmentally damaging. So again, shifting the type of packaging that's being used, maybe you're happy with the shelter materials, but just finding a new way to package them and ship them would actually reduce the impact there even further. So that's the kind of the decision thinking that we want to help kind of develop and help people to think about when using this tool, is just how can we firstly get an idea of the CO2 equivalent impact that we're having, and secondly, what can be done to reduce that, and how can we do that in quite a simple way to help sort of make small changes to what we're doing to hopefully reduce our overall impact. So just a little bit about the tool development. There's as Kelly said, there's a beta version that will be coming soon in the next few weeks. If you're interested in playing around with it and giving that a trial, again, it's an Excel spreadsheet version, so we can just make that available to you when that is ready. So if you're interested, please do drop me an email and we can follow up on that. Just to touch on the data aspects. One of the sort of, I guess, the main challenges in developing a tool like this is sourcing the data. When we're talking about different operations in different parts of the world, the data can be vastly different in terms of, a piece of wood in this region is completely different to a piece of wood somewhere else. So actually using data that's comparable across regions and using data that is, I guess, as close as possible to accurate, although that's never going to be completely possible, is important. And we wanted to make sure that rather than using a database like a UK-focused database that is inaccessible, that we have one that's using open access data so people can see where that data has come from. And it's kind of much more transparent in terms of how we're making those calculations. So that's what a big part of what we've been trying to do, is finding available open source data to do this. And the idea behind that is that can then potentially be used in future development of the tool for focus on other areas like NFIs in particular, or looking at more packaging options. That's something that can be done as the tool develops down the line. And just for those of you who are interested in kind of this idea of CO2 equivalent impacts informing decision making, this is one part of environmental impact, which is one part of decision making as a whole for shelter operations. So how would the figures that this tool provide, how do they kind of feed into decision making, or how can they help to shape shelter programming? We've actually co-authored a chapter in the forthcoming Roadmap for Research initiative that was led by Interaction. It's a shelter-focused initiative, and they were looking at knowledge gaps and research gaps in shelter. And we've contributed a chapter there looking at an environmental balanced scorecard approach, so a way of weighting different environmental issues and thinking about them and how that should influence decision-making potentially. So that's a little bit about what we've been up to. And hopefully that was interesting and all made sense. I think we've got a bit of time for questions now. Our email addresses are both there as well if you'd like to follow up. But I think I'll stop sharing now and we can go to questions and a bit of a discussion. Thank you.
This is Kelly again. I just wanted to emphasize that, as George mentioned, the beta version will be available shortly. So we're actually very interested in finding organizations or individuals who'd like to just test it and see how it works. It's supposed to be very simple, non-expert. So we want to see how it works in the field. Thanks.
Okay, so I've seen a question in the chat there about can the tool be applicable or used for other sectors? That's something that, again, we're sort of part of the reason for using the open access database and kind of being really transparent about where we're getting that data from is the hope that in the future it can maybe be adapted or can be built upon to focus on other sectors. At the moment, with the work that we're doing at the moment and this first version of the tool, it will be focused on shelter construction materials specifically. So we're looking at the sort of materials that will go into kind of the structural elements of a shelter. As I mentioned, that there's interest in looking at maybe developing that to look more at NFIs and things like that. That's for down the line in the future, hopefully. But at the moment, it will be shelter material focused.
I'd also note that there are other tools, actually online tools, for instance, calculating transportation, CO2 produced through transportation, and including CO2 produced from transporting cargo by air or sea or other things. So you actually can find some online tools, fairly simple tools, drop-down menus and checks. This is specific for the shelters, George said. This is specific for the shelter sector. But it can be, as long as there's the research needed to get the data sheets that provide the data that go into the system, then it can be developed over time to include more items. And we've been discussing that. I also should note that there are a number of other initiatives that are going on in this area, one by UNHCR, which is using sustainable lifecycle analysis. USAID, as I mentioned, with packaging. The logistics cluster is also looking at packaging and environmental footprint. And then also the ICRC and IFRC are just starting a project that's looking at sort of this carbon footprint from a much broader perspective. So there are a number of efforts going on, and there are some tools already available. And there's research going on, University of Bath, and others that are looking at this. But we hope this to be a practical, usable tool that can be of immediate application in shelter operations.
Yeah, and again, I think it's kind of hopefully a kind of easy to use sort of introductory first step into thinking about some of these things, which was what the kind of the original list tool was designed for kind of in the kind of retail sector, thinking about this in a sector that that are not LCA experts. So we're hoping that kind of this is kind of a simple tool. It's a simple LCA methodology. Again, the output is expressed in kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions. So it's a showcase of how this sort of methodology could be used, and hopefully that will allow for consideration. And once people start to use it and start to report what they're finding in this tool, that can then lead to more complex development down the line potentially. But this is very much a kind of a simple, hopefully quick and easy to use tool.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add, it was me who posted the question. I was asking just basically because of the methodology, because I think that the methodology could, as you said, could be useful for other sectors. Because once you learn to calculate, then you can translate that into other sectors. The only problem maybe, or the main problem I would say, is if we share the same emission factors to measure. So that's could create a problem, and I think that's because of that. Maybe to share information, it's good on one sector, but I was just mainly referring to the methodology that could be helpful, because also you have different methodologies to measure, like for example the carbon footprint of the organization. So not going into sectors, but just like the general transportation and all that. So it gives you different views. So yeah, that
on that. Maya, thanks a lot. On that, one thing that George touched on, but has been part of the development process, is to use the input comes from data sheets that are developed by sometimes private and sometimes public organizations But what we're trying to do is use data sheets that are both appropriate for the materials being used for the construction efforts in a humanitarian situation, but also ones that are publicly available, so that everything that's in the tool, the back office part of it, the calculation, what the calculations are based on, is going to be transparent and evident and can be changed or added to over time. So it's not a proprietary databases, but public databases. And there have been some challenges in finding databases that are appropriate there. But it is important that as we go through this process of starting to assess, both within the shelter sector and then in other sectors, the environmental footprint or the CO2 equivalent, that we continue to use as much as possible the same databases. Otherwise, we'll end up looking at the same thing and coming up with different results, which is always confusing to everybody. So that's probably something that we need to look at in the near future and sort of develop an understanding of the databases to be used here. But that's something that we're trying to be very transparent about in this tool.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So expanding a bit on the thinking about this, as I mentioned this in the other session, presently there's at least one donor that's interested in carbon footprinting to a certain degree. Other donors are not yet as advanced in looking at their environmental footprint from that perspective. CO2 equivalent is not the only way of measuring environmental impacts. As a matter of fact, when you start doing permanent shelter, there's a whole process that should be followed in terms of environmental impact assessment or environmental safeguards and things like that. So this is only one part of that process. But collecting this kind of information and over time expanding it out to other sources, other aspects of humanitarian operations also provides opportunities for organizations to look at both how do they offset the carbon footprint or the carbon equivalent of their operations, and particularly the shelter operations, but also looking at whether there needs to be a process for looking for additional funding for lower carbon footprint efforts. For instance, making a choice between two different materials, the one with the lower carbon footprint may be costlier, and a donor may not be willing to pay for that. So is there some way to look at that kind of offset? So that offset process is all available. You go online and buy a plane ticket, you can try to offset the CO2 equivalent produced by the plane flight. And this may be something the humanitarian sector wants to start looking at, particularly if they start reporting on CO2 equivalent, then somebody's going to say, well, what are you doing about it? And there may be relatively limited options to reduce it in a humanitarian context, and so it needs to be offset. So this is providing more information here sort of expands the thinking and the options that might be available to humanitarian organizations in dealing with some of these issues. Thanks.
Well, sorry, me again, just to mention on what you said, Charles, it's very interesting, and it's very important that we as a community also that we are able to calculate this offsetting, because at some point we are going to be kind of obliged to have net zero, or as much as possible net zero projects. So these kind of projects would have different budget. So yes, if you want me to reduce and to do those kinds of projects, then maybe donors should be prepared also to pay for that. It's like, okay, this is a net zero project, and this is a normal project, and this have this cost, and this other one have other costs. So we as a community need to be able to know that, and to speak freely and maturely with donors also.
And another aspect, I just want to highlight some of the utility of this or how it could be used. The other, from the example that George was showing about the different bar charts, and the example that he cited was the case of shelter assistance being shipped to a location before the disaster rather than having to be flown in after the disaster. As we're moving into a situation where there's an anticipatory response and identifying likely humanitarian requirements for different areas, particularly from natural hazards, that then this kind of calculation then fits into that process by saying, if we ship this much in now, we would be saving this much carbon footprint because we're using a ship, which is much more efficient than an airplane. And so we talk about it now in terms of humanitarian response, immediate response, but some of the preparedness planning and thinking in the preparedness sector, particularly anticipatory response, also can use the tool as it is now or in the beta version. But there are other tools that can be actually, or other components that will be added onto that to sort of start costing out in a more environmentally sensitive way how you can respond to disasters.
That's great.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of add maybe as a kind of another point there as well, I think that one of the things you mentioned in the last session was the kind of the focus on carbon impact and carbon footprint is increasingly something that people are discussing. Someone made the comment about the fact that consumers are increasingly interested in the carbon footprint of goods that they're buying in supermarkets and things like that. That actually this is likely to become more and more important in terms of reporting and in terms of being able to showcase that this is something that is being thought about. And so to have something that's really quick and easy to use and hopefully gives a useful metric that can be used to compare different options at this point is useful in starting that conversation. I think that again, sort of part of the focus on having the CO2 equivalent emissions as our kind of metric, that's not intended to be a substitute for an overall detailed environmental assessment, like something like what UNHCR are doing with their lifecycle sustainability assessment on their specific shelter designs. This isn't meant to necessarily replace that, but it is. Whereas with kind of a detailed environmental assessment like that, you would get a lot of usable data that gives you a really good overview of all the various environmental impacts you might have. In terms of actually operationalizing that and using it in a field situation where you're trying to make a decision about different materials, that can often be too complicated, too complex, and not really actionable. Whereas to be able to use the CO2 equivalent emissions as a kind of proxy for carbon footprint, environmental impact, that allows for this kind of decision making to be considered, and hopefully starts the conversation, as Kelly mentioned, the kind of, well, what if we tried this instead, or what if we did use this packaging? What if we tried to source it more locally or ship it in a different way? Or starting that conversation, which I think is helpful in hopefully having immediate impacts in terms of a reduction in environmental impact that can be relatively easily achieved.
And I also want to emphasize as we close that this is a collaborative process. BRE Trust has been leading the technical work on it, but it's also involved the World Wildlife Fund and also the Environment Community of Practice at the Global Shelter Cluster. As I said before, we hope for a tool that in a process that's transparent, and that can be built out over time, adding in different data sheets and expanding the basic process with more information and more drop-down options and things like that. So we look for that kind of collaboration in the future. And on behalf of myself, and I guess, George, I'd like to thank you for the time you've taken to be part of this session. We had a little bit less technical challenges than the last time around. I hope it's been informative, and please contact us if you're interested in more information or participating in the beta test. Over to you, George. You got 5 seconds.
Just to say thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you back in the main session.